Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the deepest secrets. Kyle Jacobs had lost his grandfather without ever really knowing him, and that quiet regret had stayed with him for years. When he inherited an old mountain cabin in northern Montana, Kyle saw it as one last chance to understand the man who had raised his father. His daughter Sophie, 25, and longing for connection to her family's past, drove up with him through the snow. The cabin was remote and forgotten, buried under decades of dust. On their second night, a storm trapped them inside. While moving firewood near the stone hearth, they found a trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. What secret had been sealed in that cellar for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Billings had taken most of the day, winding through mountain passes that grew narrower with each mile. Kyle Jacobs kept both hands on the wheel, his 52-year-old reflexes still sharp despite the white knuckles. Beside him, his daughter Sophie adjusted her camera settings, capturing the late afternoon light as it filtered through towering pines. "How much farther?" she asked, not looking up from her viewfinder. "According to the GPS, about 20 minutes. But the lawyer said the last few miles can be tricky this time of year." Sophie lowered her camera and studied her father's profile. He'd been quiet most of the drive, lost in thoughts he hadn't shared. She recognized that distant look, the same expression he'd worn at her grandfather's funeral 6 months ago, standing at the graveside as if waiting for answers that would never come. "You never really talked about him much," Sophie said gently. "Grandpa Harold, I mean, even when I was growing up." Kyle sighed, his breath fogging slightly in the cold cabin air. There wasn't much to tell. He was always just there. Quiet. Kind enough, but distant. Even after your grandmother died, even when he'd come visit after your mum passed, he always seemed like he was somewhere else in his mind. Do you think he was lonely, living up here all by himself? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he wanted it that way. Kyle paused, navigating a sharp turn. "My father, your grandfather's son, he died when I was 19. Car accident on a winter road, not unlike this one. Harold helped me through that time, helped pay for college. But even then, even in those moments when we should have been close, there was this wall. Like he was holding something back." Sophie reached over and squeezed her father's arm. At 25, she'd seen enough of life's disappointments to understand that sometimes people carried things they couldn't share. Her own recent breakup in Seattle had taught her that much. She'd moved back home 3 months ago, ostensibly to save money, but really to figure out who she was beyond the relationship that had defined her early 20s. "Maybe this trip will help you understand him better," she offered. The GPS announced their turn onto an unmarked dirt road, barely visible beneath a fresh layer of snow. Kyle shifted into 4-wheel drive and eased the truck forward. The road climbed steadily, winding through stands of aspen and pine. Snow clung to every branch, and the world seemed wrapped in cotton silence. Then, around a final bend, the cabin appeared. It sat in a small clearing, backed against a wall of sheer granite cliffs that rose hundreds of feet into the grey sky. The structure was larger than Kyle had expected, not a small hunting shack, but a substantial 2-story log home with a stone chimney climbing one wall. The logs were weathered but solid, and despite decades without regular habitation, the roof appeared intact. "Wow," Sophie breathed, already reaching for her camera. "Dad, this is beautiful." They parked and climbed out into the cold. The air bit at their faces, sharp and clean. Snow crunched under their boots as they approached the front door. Kyle pulled the key from his pocket. The lawyer had mailed it along with the deed, and a brief note. "Your grandfather left specific instructions that this property passed to you. He said you'd know what to do with it when the time came." The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing an interior thick with dust but remarkably well preserved. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like ghosts, waiting for resurrection. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by built-in bookshelves. Through a doorway, Kyle could see a kitchen with an old wood-burning stove. "It's like stepping back in time," Sophie murmured, moving through the space with her camera raised. Kyle pulled sheets off furniture, releasing clouds of dust into the slanting afternoon light. A sturdy oak table. 2 leather armchairs, cracked with age but still solid. A desk by the window, its surface empty except for a thin layer of grey powder. On the mantel above the fireplace, Kyle found a small display case. Inside, mounted on faded blue velvet, was a Bronze Star medal. He lifted the case carefully, turning it to catch the light. The citation card was still legible. For heroic achievement in connection with military operations 1945. "I never knew he served," Kyle said quietly. "He never mentioned the war. Not once." Sophie joined him, photographing the medal. "There's so much we don't know about people, even the ones we think we know best." They spent the next hour exploring. Upstairs, they found 2 bedrooms, both spare and functional. The bathroom had modern plumbing, likely updated at some point, though the fixtures were decades old. In a closet, Kyle discovered neatly folded linens, sealed in plastic to protect them from moisture and time. But it was downstairs, in a smaller room off the kitchen that might have been a pantry, where Kyle found the photographs. They were in a shoebox on a high shelf, and something made him pull it down. Inside were perhaps 24 black and white photographs, most showing mountain landscapes. A few featured men in what looked like military gear, though the uniforms were unclear in the faded images. One photograph in particular caught Kyle's attention. It showed a young man, maybe 30 years old, standing in snow with mountains behind him. The man's face was serious, almost somber, but there was something familiar in the eyes, the set of the jaw. Kyle turned the photo over. On the back, in faded pencil, "Winter 1945. "Is that him?" Sophie asked, looking over his shoulder. "I think so. He would have been in his early 20s then. But I've never seen him look like this, so young, so—" Kyle struggled for the word. "Haunted," Sophie supplied. Yes, Kyle thought. That was it. Exactly. The man in the photograph looked like someone carrying a weight that couldn't be set down. As the afternoon faded into evening, they worked to make the cabin livable. Kyle got the generator running. It coughed and sputtered, but eventually caught. They found firewood stacked neatly in a covered area behind the cabin, dry and ready. Within an hour, they had a fire crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the log walls. They ate a simple dinner from the supplies they'd brought, sitting at the oak table while wind whistled through the surrounding pines. The isolation was absolute. No cell service, no neighbors for miles. Just the 2 of them and a house full of questions. "Tell me what you remember about him," Sophie said. "Any stories at all?" Kyle leaned back, cradling a cup of coffee. "He moved here after the war. Met my grandmother sometime in the early 50s. Married her. She was from Great Falls, working as a school teacher. They had my father in 1956. She died when I was 12, heart attack, sudden. Harold just kept going. Raised my father here, then helped raise me after Dad died. But it was like he was going through the motions. Present, but not really there. Dead before I was born." He spoke a little Norwegian, some German too. I remember being surprised by that once, hearing him talk to someone in German at a hardware store in Billings. But when I asked him about it, he just said he'd picked it up during the war. Sophie stood and walked to the fireplace, studying the Bronze Star. "This medal, it means he saw combat. Did something brave. You don't get one of these for sitting behind a desk." "No," Kyle agreed. "You don't." That night, lying in the upstairs bedroom under heavy quilts, Kyle found sleep elusive. The cabin creaked and settled around him, speaking in a language he didn't understand. Somewhere in these walls, in these rooms, his grandfather had lived for more than 60 years. What had he thought about during all those long winter nights? What memories had he carried up this mountain and held close in the silence? Kyle thought about his own life, teaching history to bored teenagers, raising Sophie alone after his wife's death, the quiet routine of small-town existence. Had his grandfather found peace in this isolation, or had it been a kind of prison? Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. The storm arrived the next afternoon with startling swiftness. What had been light flurries in the morning became a wall of white by 2 o'clock. Wind hammered against the cabin walls, and visibility dropped to mere feet beyond the windows. Kyle checked his phone, still no signal, and turned on the small emergency radio they'd found in the kitchen. The crackling voice of a weather service announcer confirmed what he could see. A major winter storm, expected to drop 2 to 3 feet of snow over the next 36 hours. Travel not advised. "Well," Sophie said, peering out at the whiteout conditions, "guess we're staying a while longer." They spent the morning making the cabin more comfortable, unpacking properly, organizing supplies. Kyle found himself drawn to his grandfather's things, examining each object for clues to the man's inner life. The books on the shelves were an eclectic mix: military history, Norwegian literature, German poetry, and surprisingly, several volumes on mountain climbing and survival. In the attic, accessed by a narrow stairway, they discovered old tools, hunting equipment, and several journals. Kyle's heart quickened as he opened the first one, but disappointment followed. The entries were mundane weather observations, maintenance notes, records of firewood cut and game spotted. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. "It's like he was deliberately avoiding saying anything that mattered," Kyle muttered. By late afternoon, the fire was burning low. Kyle remembered the interior woodpile he'd seen near the hearth, a convenience for cold nights when you didn't. "You want to venture outside?" He began moving the split logs, stacking them more efficiently to make room for their gear. That's when he noticed it. The floorboards beneath the woodpile didn't quite match the rest. The wood was the same age, the same weathering, but there was a seam too straight, too precise to be natural. "Sophie," he called, "come look at this." She knelt beside him, running her fingers along the gap. "Is this I think it's a door." Kyle cleared away more wood, his movements becoming urgent. The outline became clear. A trapdoor, perhaps 3 feet square, set flush with the floor. He found the edge with his fingernails, pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The hinges were rusted, the wood swollen with decades of moisture and time. More concerning was what he saw when he cleared away the last of the debris. Carved faintly into the wood, worn but still visible, was a symbol, an iron cross, the distinctive German military insignia. Kyle sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. His grandfather had fought for America. The Bronze Star proved that. So why was there a German symbol carved into a hidden trapdoor in his floor? "Dad?" Sophie's voice was uncertain. "What does this mean?" "I don't know." But even as he said it, dark possibilities were forming. Had his grandfather taken this as a trophy, or did it mean something else, something worse? They debated through the evening. Should they open it? What right did they have to pry into whatever Harold had chosen to hide? But the question gnawed at Kyle. What if his grandfather had been someone other than who he claimed? What if the quiet, kind man who had helped raise him had carried secrets that would change everything Kyle believed about his family? Sophie's position was clear. "We need to know. He left this place to you. Maybe he wanted you to find it. Or maybe he wanted it to stay buried. Then why not destroy it? Why keep it?" It was a good question, one Kyle couldn't answer. That night, neither of them slept well. The storm raged outside, rattling windows, piling snow against the walls. And below them, beneath the floorboards, something waited in the darkness. By dawn, the storm showed no signs of abating. They were trapped, and Kyle realized that even if they wanted to leave, even if they chose to walk away from whatever secrets lay below, they couldn't. The choice had been made for them. He found a crowbar in the tool shed, had to shovel through 2 feet of fresh snow to reach it. Back inside, shaking off the cold, he stood over the trapdoor with Sophie beside him. "Last chance to change our minds," he said. "We're not changing our minds." The crowbar bit into the wood. Kyle pried carefully, not wanting to damage whatever might be below. The hinges protested, metal screaming against rust and time. Then, with a final groan, the door lifted. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the musty smell of decades-sealed space. Kyle shone his flashlight down, revealing steep, wooden stairs descending into darkness. The beam swept across stone walls, caught the edge of what looked like shelves. "Wait here," he said. "Not a chance." They descended together, testing each step. The cellar was larger than Kyle expected, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, but when Kyle tried the switch, nothing happened. Their flashlights revealed the space in fragments. Wooden shelves along one wall, a metal footlocker, a small desk. Everything was covered in dust, so thick it looked like grey fur. But unlike upstairs, these items hadn't been protected, preserved. They'd simply been abandoned and sealed away. Kyle moved to the desk first. A leather-bound journal lay on its surface, closed. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking. The pages were covered in dense handwriting, German script, neat and precise. He recognized only scattered words with his limited college German, could make out dates. 1944, 1945. Why would he keep a journal in German? Sophie asked. Kyle had no answer. He moved to the shelves, where his flashlight revealed old radio equipment, hand-drawn maps showing European terrain, mountain ranges he didn't recognize, and photographs. He lifted one with trembling hands. It showed his grandfather, young and serious, wearing what appeared to be a military uniform. But not an American uniform. The style was wrong, the cut of the jacket different from what Kyle had seen in countless World War II documentaries. And standing beside Harold were other men, all in similar uniforms, posed in front of a mountain backdrop. "Oh, God," Sophie whispered. Kyle's hands shook as he examined more photographs. Harold, it was definitely him, the features unmistakable even through the decades in various settings, always in that same uniform, never with obvious Nazi insignia visible, but the implications were horrifying. The letters came next, bundled with string. Kyle could read the addresses, Oberst Harold Jacobson. He knew enough German for that. Oberst meant colonel, and Jacobson, not Jacobs. He changed his name, Kyle said, his voice hollow. After the war, Harold Jacobson became Harold Jacobs. But that doesn't mean... Sophie stopped, unable to finish the thought. Kyle moved to the footlocker, needing to know, dreading what he might find. The padlock was old, rusted through. A few hits with the crowbar and it fell away. He lifted the lid. Inside was a uniform, carefully folded. German military issue, he was certain of it now. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents. Kyle unwrapped them with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The letterhead made him stop breathing. Office of Strategic Services, United States Army. The date, March 1945. And the text, brief and official, Agent Harold Jacobson, Operation Winterfall, authorization level, top secret. Kyle read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated. His grandfather hadn't been. A Nazi. He'd been a spy. An American agent, deep undercover in the German military. "Dad?" Sophie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What does it say?" Kyle looked up at her, and then back at the documents in his hands. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his grandfather shattered and reformed into a shape he didn't yet understand. Harold Jacobs had lived a lie. Or rather, Harold Jacobson had lived the truth, and Harold Jacobs had been the lie, the comfortable fiction that came after. But why had he kept all this? Why seal it away but not destroy it? And what else was hidden down here in the darkness? Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, surrounded by the remnants of a secret life, Kyle began to understand that his grandfather's silence hadn't been emotional distance. It had been protection, though, from what he was only beginning to discover. Kyle needed air. The cellar felt suddenly suffocating, the weight of revelation pressing down on him like the tons of earth and stone above. He climbed the stairs quickly, leaving Sophie to continue documenting the space with her camera, and stepped out onto the porch despite the storm. Snow stung his face, wind tore at his jacket, but the cold was clarifying. His grandfather, the quiet man who had sat at family dinners, who had taught Kyle to tie fishing flies, who had held baby Sophie with such gentleness, had spent years living as a German officer, had spoken their language, worn their uniform, earned their trust, all while betraying them to the American government. The moral complexity made Kyle's head spin. Was it heroism or deception? Both, perhaps. Or something else entirely, something that couldn't be reduced to simple categories. He thought about the bronze star on the mantel. Now it carried new weight. Whatever his grandfather had done during the war, the American military had valued it enough to grant him one of their highest honors. But they'd also allowed him to disappear, to create a new identity and hide in these mountains for the rest of his life. What had Harold Jacobson done that required such secrecy even decades after the war ended? Sophie found him 20 minutes later, snow-covered and shivering. "Come inside," she said gently. "I found something else." Back in the cellar, she led him to the desk. She'd opened a drawer, revealing a manila envelope underneath papers and dust. Inside were documents, a birth certificate for Harold Jacobs, born in Billings, Montana, 1929, a draft registration card, Social Security documentation. "Look at the paper," Sophie said, shining her light at an angle across the birth certificate. "See how it's aged. But look at the typography, the way the text sits on the page. I've photographed enough historical documents to know this wasn't created in 1929. The paper's been artificially aged. The typewriter font is wrong for the period." Kyle examined it more closely. She was right. These documents had been created after the fact, probably in 1946 or later, and made to look decades older. His grandfather's American identity had been manufactured, provided by the OSS to protect an agent who could never safely reveal his wartime role. "There's more," Sophie said quietly. She handed him a photograph, separate from the others. It showed a young woman, dark-haired and beautiful, in a formal portrait style. On the back, in the same neat German script from the journal, "Meine geliebte Anneliese, 1943. My beloved Anneliese," Kyle translated slowly. "That's not Grandma," Sophie said. "I've seen pictures of her. She was blonde, had different features entirely, and they didn't marry until the 50s, right?" Kyle turned the photograph over again, studying the woman's face. She looked directly at the camera with dark, serious eyes. There was warmth there, but also something else, a wariness, perhaps, born of wartime. Who was she? And what had she meant to the man his grandfather had been? They spent the rest of the day piecing together what they could from the cellar's contents. The radio equipment, Kyle realized with his history teacher's knowledge, was sophisticated for its era. The frequencies marked on the dials corresponded to bands used by Allied intelligence services. The maps showed routes through the Alps, with notations in both German and English. Some routes were highlighted, dates noted beside them all, from winter 1945, the final months of the war. "He was running missions," Kyle said, spreading the maps on the desk. "Look, these routes cross from German-held territory into Switzerland or down toward Allied lines in Italy. He was moving people or information." "Or both," Sophie suggested. The journal remained frustratingly opaque. Kyle's German wasn't good enough to translate more than fragments, and even those fragments raised more questions than they answered. He could make out repeated references to Operation Winterfall, to the package, to extraction, and woven. Through the military terminology were references to a name, Annalise. As evening fell and they retreated upstairs to prepare dinner, Kyle found himself wrestling with a fundamental question. The man in the cellar, Harold Jacobson, OSS agent, wearer of German uniforms, keeper of secrets, was he the same person as the grandfather Kyle had known? Or had Harold Jacobs been yet another role, another cover identity maintained for 50 years? "I keep thinking about all those family dinners," Kyle said as they ate. Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations. He was always there, always appropriate, but always absent somehow. Like he was watching from behind glass. "Maybe he was," Sophie said. "If you spent years living a lie, never able to be yourself, always watching what you said, maybe you forget how to stop. Maybe the distance becomes permanent." It was an uncomfortable insight, made worse by its ring of truth. Kyle thought about his own tendencies toward emotional reserve, the way he'd pulled back after his wife died, the walls he'd built. Had he inherited that from Harold, or learned it by example? "There's something else that bothers me," Sophie continued. "All these documents, this uniform, the photographs, he kept everything. Why? If he wanted to leave that life behind, why not destroy it all?" Kyle had been wondering the same thing. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe these things were all he had left of who he really was. Harold Jacobs was the fiction. Harold Jacobson was real. They returned to the cellar after dinner, driven by a need to understand that overrode exhaustion. The footlocker still held items they hadn't fully examined. Beneath the uniform, Kyle found American military documents, orders, debriefings, commendations, all classified, all marked with stamps indicating they should have been destroyed decades ago. One document stood out, a letter on OSS letterhead dated September 1946, signed by a director whose name had been redacted. Kyle read it aloud to Sophie. "Agent Jacobson, your service to your country during Operation Winterfall and subsequent missions has been exemplary. The intelligence you provided shortened the war and saved countless lives. However, given the sensitive nature of your deep cover role and the ongoing security situation in occupied Europe, it has been determined that you cannot safely resume public life under your operational identity. Accordingly, authorization has been granted for you to retire into obscurity under a new identity, which will be provided. All records of your service will be classified in perpetuity. You will receive full military honors and pension under your new name, and the nation's gratitude, though that gratitude can never be publicly expressed. May you find peace in the life ahead." The words hung in the cold cellar air. Peace. Had Harold found it? Kyle doubted it. You didn't hide in the mountains for 50 years if you'd found peace. "What about Annalise?" Sophie asked. "The letter says occupied Europe, ongoing security situation. If she was German, if they were together during the war, what happened to her when he disappeared?" It was the question that had been nagging at Kyle since they'd found her photograph. A German woman in 1943, involved with a man who turned out to be an American spy. When Harold vanished, when his cover was blown or his mission ended, what had become of her? He picked up the journal again, flipping through pages of German text he couldn't read, looking for her name. He found it repeated, especially in entries from 1944. The handwriting in those sections seemed different, less military precision, more emotion bleeding through the careful script. "We need to get this translated," Kyle said. "The whole journal. There's a story here, and I think it's—" He paused, searching for words. "I think it's the story Harold could never tell anyone. Maybe the story he needed someone to eventually find." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. But inside the cabin, inside the sealed cellar with its secrets and ghosts, Kyle felt like they were only now entering the heart of the tempest his grandfather had weathered alone. By the third morning the storm had passed, leaving the world transformed under 3 feet of fresh snow. But the road remained impassable, and Kyle found himself grateful for the forced isolation. They needed time with what they'd discovered, time to process the weight of it. Sophie had taken on the task of translating the journal, using her phone's camera to photograph each page, then running the images through translation software. It was imperfect. The handwriting and old German idioms confused the algorithms, but slowly a narrative emerged. Kyle made coffee and brought it down to the cellar, where Sophie had set up a makeshift workspace. She'd been at it since dawn, and the look on her face told him she'd found something significant. He met her in December 1943, Sophie said without preamble. Anneliese Fischer. She worked at the village medical clinic in a town called Garmisch in Bavaria. Listen to this entry. She read from her translation notes. Today I met someone who makes this charade more difficult. Her name is Anneliese Fischer, and she has eyes that see too much. I was at the clinic for a minor training injury, and she treated it with careful hands and careful questions. She asked where I was from, and I gave her my cover story, Hamburg, family dead in the bombing, transferred to mountain regiment. She nodded but watched me as if she could see through the words. I must be more cautious. Kyle settled onto the cold floor beside her. He was worried she'd expose him. At first, maybe, but keep listening. Sophie flipped through her notes. February 1944. I see her most days now. I tell myself it's part of my cover appearing normal, integrated into the community. But the truth is, I look for excuses to walk past the clinic. Yesterday she invited me to dinner with her family. Her mother is kind, her father reserved but warming to me. They lost a son on the Eastern Front. I am lying to everyone, but with Anneliese, the lies feel heavier. She continued reading entries, tracing the evolution of Harold's feelings. By spring of 1944, the journal's tone had shifted from clinical mission notes to something more personal. He wrote about walks in the mountains with Anneliese, about her laugh, about the way she spoke of wanting to see the world after the war ended. Here, Sophie said, her voice softer now. June 1944. I am in love with her. There is no other word for what I feel. Every moment with her is both joy and betrayal. She believes I am Harold Jacobson, German officer, son of Hamburg. She doesn't know that this person doesn't exist, that when the war ends, he will cease to be. What have I done? How can I love someone while lying about everything I am? Kyle felt a tightness in his chest. His grandfather had been 28, 29 years old, young, far from home, living a dangerous lie. And he'd fallen in love with someone who could never know the truth. There's more, Sophie said. August 1944. She asked me to marry her. In her culture, in this region, women propose after 2 seasons of courtship. She did it while we were sitting by the lake, watching the sunset. She said she knew the war might take me, but she wanted to be my wife for whatever time we had. I should have said no. I should have found a way to refuse without hurting her. Instead, I said yes. God help me, I said yes. The wedding took place in October 1944 in a small church in Garmisch. Harold wrote about it with anguish mixed with wonder. He described Anneliese in her simple dress, flowers in her dark hair. He wrote about speaking vows he meant with all his heart, but knowing they were spoken under a false name, a false identity. Listen to this part, Sophie said, and Kyle heard tears in her voice. The 15th of October, 1944. Today I married the woman I love. I stood in that church and promised before God and her family to love her until death. And I meant every word. But I am not who she thinks I am. When this war ends, Harold Jacobson will vanish. What happens to a marriage built on such deception? What happens to her? Kyle stood and walked to the shelves, needing to move, to process. He found the small wooden box he'd noticed before and opened it. Inside was a simple gold wedding band. He held it up to the light, saw the inscription inside, H and A, Ewig zusammen, 1944, forever together, he translated. Sophie came to stand beside him, looking at the ring. He kept it all these years. Couldn't wear it, couldn't let it go. The journal entries from late 1944 and early 1945 painted a picture of a man torn apart by impossible circumstances. Harold continued his intelligence work, passing information to Allied handlers, all while maintaining his cover as a German officer. And through it all, he came home to Anneliese, to the small apartment they shared, to the life they were building together. Then, in January 1945, everything changed. Sophie found the entry and read it in a hushed voice. Orders came today. Operation Winterfall is active. I am to extract a high-value defector, a German colonel who wants to provide intelligence about the Alpine Redoubt fortifications. Estimated time to complete, 2 weeks. I told Anneliese I'm being transferred temporarily to Munich for special duties. She nodded, but I saw fear in her eyes. She knows something is wrong. Last night she told me she is pregnant. 3 months along, she thinks. I held her and tried not to show my terror. What have I done to her? What will happen to them when I disappear? Kyle sank down onto the cellar stairs, the ring still in his hand. His grandfather had left a pregnant wife without being able to tell her why. Had left her believing he was someone he wasn't. Does he say what happened? Kyle asked. After the mission? Sophie scrolled. Through more photos, reading quickly. The entries get sparse. March 1945, just brief notes. Received package that must be the defector. Route compromised, taking alternate path. Then nothing for 2 weeks. She found the next entry, dated April 1945, and her face went pale as she read it. Oh no, Dad. What? What does it say? The 3rd of April 1945. The safe house was discovered. Gestapo came in force. The defector and I escaped, but the safe house keeper and his daughter died in the firefight. 2 more deaths on my conscience. We made it through the passes, reached Allied lines yesterday. The defector's intelligence is valuable, they say, will shorten the war. But I keep seeing that girl's face. She was 16. And Anneliese, I can never go back. My cover is burned, my identity compromised. The OSS says I must disappear completely. The war will end soon, they tell me. Germany will be occupied. If I go back, if anyone connects me to the intelligence leaks, Anneliese will be targeted. The only way to keep her safe is to stay dead. She is 3 months pregnant with my child, and I must stay dead. The cellar was silent, except for the sound of Sophie's ragged breathing. Kyle tried to imagine it, his grandfather, 29 years old, having just completed a mission that cost innocent lives, learning he could never return to his wife, could never meet his child. There's one more entry, Sophie said quietly, dated the 30th of April, 1945. The day Hitler died. She read, "The war in Europe is effectively over. I am told I did valuable service, that the intelligence saved lives, but I cannot stop thinking about her. Is she safe? Has she had the baby? Does she think I'm dead, or does she think I abandoned her? Both are unbearable. I was given a choice today. Return to America with a new identity, full honors and pension, or try to find her and risk exposing everything, putting her in danger from those who would see her as a traitor's wife. It is no choice at all. The man she married must stay dead. Harold Jacobson must cease to exist. And so he will. I will become someone else, somewhere else. But I will carry her with me until I die. Anneliese, if you somehow read this, I loved you. I loved you truly. Everything else was a lie, but not that. Never that. Kyle looked at the ring in his hand, at the promise engraved inside. Forever together. Except they hadn't been. His grandfather had spent the next 50 years in these mountains, alone, carrying the weight of that loss. "There's nothing after that?" Kyle asked. "Nothing about her. The rest of the journal is after he became Harold Jacobs. Just weather notes, maintenance logs. Like he shut down that part of himself completely." Kyle thought about the man he'd known, the emotional distance, the silence, the way Harold had seemed to be perpetually somewhere else. Now he understood. Part of Harold had never left that village in Bavaria. Part of him had stayed with Anneliese, with the child he'd never met, with the life he'd abandoned to keep them safe. "What happened to her?" Sophie asked. "To Anneliese and the baby?" Kyle had no answer. But looking around the cellar, at the carefully preserved documents and photographs, at the wedding ring kept for decades, he knew one thing. His grandfather had never stopped wondering the same thing. The fourth morning brought clearer skies and the distant sound of snowplows working the main roads. They'd be able to leave by afternoon, Kyle thought. Return to normal life, to teaching and routines, and the comfortable distance from the past. But something made him hesitate, made him want to search the cellar one more time. "I feel like we're missing something," he told Sophie over breakfast. "Why keep all of this? Why preserve it so carefully if he never wanted anyone to know?" "Maybe he did want someone to know," Sophie suggested. "Eventually. Just not while he was alive to face questions." They returned to the cellar together, examining every corner they might have overlooked. Kyle checked the footlocker again, running his hands along the interior seams. That's when he felt it a slight irregularity, a place where the fabric lining didn't quite sit flush. He pulled at the fabric, and it came away easily, revealing an envelope taped to the underside of the lid. It was addressed in Harold's shaky handwriting, "To Kyle Jacobs, open when you find this place." Kyle's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were several pages, a letter written in the careful script of someone whose hands no longer obeyed perfectly. The date at the top was from 6 months ago, just weeks before Harold's death. He read aloud, his voice unsteady. "Kyle, if you're reading this, you've found my past. I left instructions with my lawyer that you inherit this cabin, hoping eventually curiosity would lead you here. I'm dying. The doctors give me weeks, maybe a month, and I find I cannot take these secrets to my grave after all. Some truths need to be spoken, even if I lack the courage to speak them face to face." Kyle paused, swallowed hard, then continued. "You've found the journal, I assume. The uniform, the documents. You know now that I was not who I claimed to be. Harold Jacobson was my real name, born to Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota, 1921. The OSS recruited me in 1942 because I spoke fluent German and Norwegian. They created a false identity, inserted me into German officer training, and for 3 years I lived as the enemy. Operation Winterfall was my final mission. The objective was to extract a German colonel who wanted to defect, a man with detailed intelligence about Hitler's Alpine redoubt plans. The mission was compromised. We were ambushed at a mountain safe house. 2 civilians died, a father and daughter who had sheltered us. Their deaths haunt me still." Sophie moved closer, reading over Kyle's shoulder as he continued. "But the worst of it, Kyle, the part I've carried for 75 years, is Anneliese. I loved her. That wasn't part of the mission, wasn't part of the plan. I met her in late 1943, and by 1944 I knew I was in love. I should have stayed away, should have maintained professional distance. Instead, I married her. Under my false identity, I married her. When Operation Winterfall activated, she was 3 months pregnant. I left her thinking I'd return in 2 weeks. Instead, my cover was blown, and the OSS told me I could never go back. For her safety, for the baby's safety, Harold Jacobson had to disappear completely. Anyone associated with me would be investigated, possibly targeted as a collaborator. The only way to protect her was to stay dead." Kyle had to stop reading, his vision blurred. Sophie took the letter from him and continued, I tried to find her after the war. Sent inquiries through relief agencies, through military channels. The village was in the Soviet occupation zone. Information was nearly impossible to get. It took years, but eventually he learned the truth. Anneliese died in January 1946. Influenza, malnutrition, the hardships of post-war Germany. She was 26 years old. The child survived. A daughter. Anneliese's sister raised her. I found this out in 1950, but by then the Iron Curtain was impenetrable. I had remarried. Your grandmother was a good woman, Kyle, and I cared for her deeply. But part of me never left that Bavarian village. Sophie's voice caught, but she pushed on. In 1995, after the Berlin Wall fell and records became accessible, I received a letter. It was from her, from my daughter, Greta Fischer. She had spent years searching for her father, following trails through military records and refugee documents. She found Harold Jacobson, traced him to Harold Jacobs. She was 65 years old when she wrote to me. Kyle grabbed the letter back. Wait, she contacted him? He knew about her? He read frantically now. We exchanged letters for 28 years. She sent photographs. She had married, had children of her own, grandchildren. My family, Kyle, your family, your aunt, your cousins, all living in Germany. I never told your father. I never told anyone. I was afraid of judgment, afraid of complicating lives that seemed settled. I was a coward. Greta understood why I couldn't return during the war. She forgave me, but I never forgave myself. I maintained the correspondence in secret because I didn't know how to explain without revealing everything, the OSS, the mission, the lies I'd built my American life upon. The letter's final paragraph made Kyle's heart race. There's more in the desk drawer, under the false bottom. Press the back left corner, and it will release. Inside you'll find Greta's letters, photographs, contact information. She wanted to meet you, Kyle, wanted to know her American family. I kept you separate, kept these worlds apart, because I didn't know how to bridge them. But the war ended 80 years ago. The secrecy isn't necessary anymore. I hope you can do what I couldn't bring these families together. Tell Greta I'm sorry. Tell her I loved her mother until my last breath. And tell her that her family across the ocean would like to know her, if you're willing. The casualties of war don't have to be permanent. Kyle almost ran to the desk. His fingers found the corner Harold had described, pressed, and heard a soft click. A panel lifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were bundled letters, dozens of them, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Photographs showed an elderly woman with Harold's eyes and Anneliese's dark hair. More photographs showed her family, sons, daughters, grandchildren. A family tree, meticulously documented in Harold's handwriting, showed the German branch of the Jacobson family. And at the bottom, a single sheet of paper with current contact information, Greta Fischer, an address in Bavaria, a phone number, an email address. Sophie picked up the most recent letter, dated just 2 years ago. Dad, listen, dear Harold, I hope this letter finds you well. My grandson Thomas just graduated from university. He wants to study American history. I wish he could meet his American family, hear stories about both sides of our heritage. I respect your wishes to keep us separate, but I want you to know that when you're gone, I hope your family will want to know us. My mother spoke of you until her death. She called you her vanished love. She never remarried, never stopped waiting. I think she knew, somehow, that you hadn't abandoned her by choice. I wish you peace, dear father, and I hope someday our families can meet. With love, Greta. Kyle sat down heavily on the cellar steps, the weight of it crashing over him. His grandfather had maintained a secret correspondence for nearly 3 decades. Had another daughter, other grandchildren, great-grandchildren. An entire family that Kyle had never known existed. We have to contact her, Sophie said immediately. Dad, she's 79 years old. She's been waiting her whole life. Kyle looked at the photographs spread before him, at Greta's face, so like his father's, at her children who were his cousins, at the grandchildren who shared his blood. Harold had lived between two worlds, unable to bridge them, carrying the weight of that separation until it killed him. But Harold was gone now, and his final wish, expressed in shaking handwriting just before death, was clear. "Yes," Kyle said quietly. "Yes, we contact her. We finish what he couldn't." For the first time since they'd opened the trapdoor, Kyle felt something other than grief and confusion. He felt purpose. His grandfather had spent 50 years hiding, protecting, carrying impossible secrets alone. But those secrets were out now, and with them came possibility. The war had ended 80 years ago. It was time for the casualties to come home. They spent the rest of the day in careful deliberation. Kyle spread Greta's letters across the cabin's oak table, reading each one multiple times, trying to understand the woman who had written them. Her tone was warm but cautious, respectful of Harold's boundaries, even as she expressed hope for eventual connection. She never pushed him, Kyle observed, never demanded anything, just kept the door open. Sophie was studying the family tree Harold had compiled. "Look at this. She has 2 sons, Klaus and Werner, and a daughter, Helene, 6 grandchildren total. Thomas, the one who wanted to study American history, he's 23, almost my age." The reality of it was staggering. Kyle had cousins he'd never met, an aunt who had spent her life wondering about her American family. And they'd all been kept separate by Harold's fear, his shame, his inability to reconcile the two halves of his life. "What do we say?" Kyle asked, staring at his laptop. The cabin's generator provided enough power, and he'd managed to get a weak internet signal by climbing to the loft. "How do you write an email to family you didn't know existed?" They drafted it together, revision after revision. The tone had to be right, respectful of the complexity, acknowledging the years of separation, but warm and open. "Start with who you are," Sophie suggested. "Make it personal." Kyle typed slowly, speaking the words aloud as he wrote, "Dear Greta Fisher, my name is Kyle Jacobs. I am Harold Jacobs' grandson, your half-brother's son. I am writing to tell you that Harold passed away 6 months ago, peacefully, at the age of 94. But I'm also writing to tell you that your letters were treasured and that his final wish was for our families to know each other." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "My daughter Sophie and I recently inherited Harold's mountain cabin. While exploring it, we discovered a hidden cellar containing his wartime documents, his journal, and your correspondence. We learned about Harold Jacobson, about Operation Winterfall, and about Annalise. We learned that you are our family." Sophie read over his shoulder, nodding encouragement. "Harold wrote me a letter, which he left in the cellar, knowing I would find it. In it, he expressed regret for keeping your families separate. He called himself a coward for not bridging that gap while he was alive. His final wish was that we do what he couldn't bring these families together." Kyle stopped, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Sophie squeezed his shoulder, and he continued, "I cannot speak for Harold's choices, or judge the impossible circumstances he faced, but I can tell you that we would be deeply honored to know you and your family. If you're willing, we would like very much to meet you, to finally connect the two halves of Harold's heart, as you once wrote." He attached several photographs of himself and Sophie, of Harold in his later years, of the cabin nestled against its mountain wall. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, he added a photo of the wedding ring they'd found, with its inscription visible. "With hope and respect, Kyle and Sophie Jacobs." His finger hovered over the send button. This was irrevocable. Once sent, it would change everything, connect worlds that had been separate for 80 years. "Do it," Sophie said quietly. "He asked you to." Kyle pressed send. The email disappeared into the digital ether, traveling instantly across an ocean that had once been an insurmountable barrier. It was 11:47 p.m. Montana time, early morning in Germany. Neither of them could sleep. They sat by the fire, talking through the night about what might come next. What if Greta didn't want contact after all? What if she resented the American family for Harold's absence from her life? What if the cultural and language barriers were too great? But deeper than the fears was something else. Excitement, possibility. Sophie talked about her photography, about documenting their extended family story. Kyle found himself imagining conversations about history with cousins who'd lived through the aftermath of the war his grandfather had fought. "He saved lives," Kyle said as dawn approached. "The intelligence he provided, the mission he completed," the OSS letter said, "it shortened the war. That means something." "But he sacrificed his own happiness," Sophie replied. "Lived alone for 50 years, carrying guilt and loss. Is that a fair trade? I don't know. Maybe that's not for us to judge. He made the choices he thought were right at the time." The sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Kyle stood at the window, coffee cup warming his hands, and thought about Harold Jacobson standing in these same mountains 75 years ago, knowing he could never return to the woman he loved. At 9:15 a.m., Kyle's laptop chimed. New email. His heart hammered as he opened it. The sender, Greta Fisher. Subject line, "My American family, finally." He read it aloud, his voice shaking. "Dear Kyle and Sophie, I have been waiting so long to hear from you. When I saw Harold's obituary in the International Military Database 6 months ago, I grieved alone, unable to share my loss with anyone who would understand. I hoped that somehow his American family would find my letters, would want to know me, but I didn't know how to reach out without knowing if you'd even want contact." Kyle had to pause, overcome. Sophie gripped his hand, urging him to continue. "Your email arrived this morning like an answer to 75 years of prayer. Yes, I want to know you. I have always wanted to know you. My mother died believing Harold abandoned her, but I learned the truth as an adult. I understood his impossible position. I forgave him long ago. Harold and I wrote for 28 years. He told me about his American family, about you, Kyle, about your daughter, Sophie. He spoke of you with such pride, such love. It broke my heart that he felt he couldn't bring us together while he lived. I am 79 years old now. My children, your cousins, know about Harold, about the wartime romance, but I honored his wish not to contact you directly. Now that wish has changed, and I am grateful beyond words." The email's conclusion made Kyle's eyes blur with tears. "If you are willing, I would very much like to meet you. Please, come to Bavaria. Let me show you where Harold and my mother met, where they married. Let me introduce you to your cousins, Klaus, Werner, and Helene. Let me show you that Harold's sacrifice, though it cost him dearly, created something beautiful. Two families, separated by war and circumstance, can finally become one. My mother used to say that love outlasts everything, even death, even separation. I believe she was right. With all my heart, I hope to meet you soon. Your aunt, Greta." Kyle looked at Sophie through his tears and saw his own emotions reflected in her face. Joy, relief, anticipation, and something else, a sense of completion, of a circle closing. "We're going to Germany," Sophie said. "Yes," Kyle agreed. "We're going to meet our family." Outside, the snow was melting in the morning sun. Inside the cabin, in the cellar below, Harold Jacobson's secrets had finally found their purpose. Not as burden or shame, but as bridge, a way to bring together what war and fear and silence had torn apart. Kyle typed his response immediately, promising they would come as soon as arrangements could be made. When he pressed send this time, his hands were steady. This was right. This was what Harold had wanted, what he'd been too afraid to do himself. The casualties of war didn't have to be permanent. Healing could begin even 80 years later. 6 weeks later, Kyle and Sophie landed in Munich. The flight had been long, giving Kyle too much time to think, to worry, to wonder if they were making a mistake. But when they collected their luggage and walked into the arrivals hall, those doubts evaporated. An elderly woman stood near the barrier, holding a small, handwritten sign that read, "Kyle and Sophie Jacobs, familiar." Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were unmistakably Harold's eyes, the same grey-blue, the same intensity. And in her features, Kyle saw echoes of his own father, of himself, of the photographs he'd seen of Anneliese. "Greta," he called. She turned, and her face transformed with emotion. Kyle. They met in an embrace that felt both strange and familiar, this woman who was family but also a stranger. She held him tightly, and he felt her trembling. "You look so much like him," she said, in accented but fluent English. "Like Harold. Like my mother described him." Sophie joined the embrace, and for a long moment the three of them stood together in the busy airport, an island of reunion amid the rushing crowds. The drive to Garmisch took an hour. Greta drove competently despite her age, pointing out landmarks, telling them about the region. "I taught English and French for 40 years, she explained, "always hoping I might need it to speak with you someday." The town itself was picturesque, nestled in the Bavarian Alps, with mountains rising on all sides. Traditional buildings lined the streets, their facades painted with murals. It looked like something from a storybook, preserved and peaceful. "It's changed since the war, of course," Greta said. "But the bones of it remain the same. The church where they married is just there." She pointed to a small stone church with a copper steeple. "We'll visit it tomorrow. Today, you must meet the family." Greta's home was a comfortable house on the edge of town, with a view of the mountains. As they pulled into the driveway, Kyle saw people gathered on the porch, 3 middle-aged adults and several younger faces. "My children insisted on being here," Greta said. "They've been so excited." "We all have." The introductions were a blur of names and faces. Klaus, 56, tall and serious like his mother. Werner, 53, warmer and more outgoing. Helene, 50, who immediately hugged Sophie and declared them cousins. And the grandchildren Thomas, who wanted to study American history. Margit, a doctor. Peter, Johann, Sophie, and little Anna, only 16. They gathered around a large dining table laden with traditional German food. The conversation was a mixture of English and German, with much translation and laughter at misunderstandings. But beneath the surface warmth, Kyle felt the weight of all the years that had been lost, all the family gatherings that should have included both sides of Harold's family. After dinner, as the younger cousins cleared dishes, Klaus approached Kyle with a folder. "I wanted to show you something," he said. "When Mother told us about Harold, about his wartime service, I researched what I could find. German military records, mostly." He spread papers on the table. "Your grandfather earned an Iron Cross in February 1944. He saved 3 wounded soldiers during an artillery barrage, carried them to safety. Under fire, his commanding officer wrote that Harold showed exceptional courage and dedication." Kyle stared at the documents. "But he was a spy. He was both," Klaus said gently. "He played his role completely. He was a good soldier for the side he was secretly betraying. The men he saved were real. Their families were real. The moral complexity must have been unbearable." Werner joined them. "Our grandmother, Anneliese, she spoke of him until she died. Mother was only 6 months old when Anneliese passed, but Anneliese's sister remembered everything. She told Mother that Anneliese never spoke ill of Harold. She would say, 'Your father was a good man caught in terrible times. Whatever took him from us, I choose to believe it wasn't his choice.'" "She was right," Kyle said quietly. "It wasn't." That evening, after the extended family had gone home, Kyle, Sophie, and Greta sat together in her living room. Greta brought out a wooden chest from her bedroom. These were my mother's things, she said. Her sister kept them for me. Inside was a simple wedding dress, carefully preserved despite its age. The fabric was wartime issue, nothing fancy, but it had been maintained with obvious care. Pinned to the dress was a letter, the paper yellowed but the ink still legible. "My mother wrote this for me," Greta said, "before she died. She knew she was sick, knew she might not survive." She read aloud, translating from German. "My dear daughter, I married a man named Harold in the winter of 1944. He disappeared in the spring of 1945. I don't know if he died in the final days of the war or if something else took him from me. But I choose to believe he loved me truly, even though I never understood where he went." Her voice caught, but she continued. "You were conceived in love, not abandonment. If your father survived, if he's somewhere in this world, tell him I forgive him. Tell him I waited. Tell him our daughter is beautiful and strong. Tell him the love was real, even if everything else was uncertain." Sophie was crying openly now. Kyle felt his own tears tracking down his face. "She never remarried?" he asked. "Never," she said. Her heart belonged to Harold, wherever he was. She worked at the clinic until she became too ill. She died in January 1946, influenza complicated by malnutrition. The post-war years were very hard. Greta carefully refolded the letter and placed it back with the dress. Then she reached deeper into the chest and pulled out a small box. Inside was another wedding ring, a match to the one Kyle had found in the cabin cellar. "Mother kept this," she told her sister. "Someday he'll come back for it." She never stopped believing. Kyle thought of the ring in his pocket, the one he'd brought from Montana. He pulled it out now, placed it beside Annaliese's ring. The two bands sat together for the first time in 80 years, their inscriptions facing up. H&A, Ewig zusammen, 1944. "Forever together," Greta whispered. They weren't, in life. But perhaps now, finally, they can be. The three of them sat in silence, looking at the rings, at the dress, at the tangible remnants of a love story that war had torn apart. But sitting together, 3 generations, 2 families, 2 nations, Kyle felt something shift. The separation wasn't permanent, the loss wasn't the end of the story. "Tomorrow," Greta said, "we visit the church." And then she paused, looking at Kyle and Sophie with hope in her eyes. "Then we visit my mother's grave. Together. Will you help me tell her that Harold never forgot, that he loved her until his last breath?" "Yes," Kyle said. "That's why we're here." Outside, the alpine peaks stood silent against the darkening sky, the same mountains that had watched Harold and Annaliese's brief happiness, that had witnessed the war's end, that had kept their secrets for 80 years. Now those mountains would witness the healing, the bridge being built across decades of silence. Harold Jakobsen had lived between 2 worlds, unable to unite them. But his grandson could finish what he'd started. The families separated by war and secrecy could finally become whole. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp alpine day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Kyle woke early in Greta's guest room, disoriented for a moment before remembering where he was. Germany. About to visit the grave of a woman his grandfather had loved and lost 80 years ago. He found Greta already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and old photograph albums spread before her. She looked up when he entered, offered a tired smile. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Today feels important, like we're completing something that's been unfinished for so long." Kyle poured himself coffee and sat beside her. The albums contained photographs from Greta's life, her childhood with her aunt, her school years, her own wedding, her children growing up. A whole life lived in the shadow of a father she'd never known. "Do you resent him?" Kyle asked quietly. "Harold, I mean, for not being there?" Greta considered the question carefully. "I did when I was younger. before I understood the full story, but after I learned the truth, after we began corresponding, no. How could I resent a man who gave up everything to protect us? Who carried that loss for 50 years rather than risk bringing danger to my mother? She turned a page, revealing photographs from the 1,990 letters visible in some shots, addressed in Harold's handwriting. He sent me pictures of your father, of you. He told me stories about your lives. He wanted to know me, wanted me to know you. The separation hurt him as much as it hurt us. Sophie joined them, and they spent the morning looking through the albums together, building bridges across the decades of separation. Klaus, Werner, and Helene arrived mid-morning, along with Thomas and Margit. They would all go together to the cemetery. First, though, Greta wanted to show them the village. They walked through narrow streets to the small church with its copper steeple. Inside, it was simple and beautiful, with wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. They stood here, Greta said, indicating the altar. The 15th of October 1944. My mother in her simple dress, Harold in his uniform. The priest who married them survived the war. He told my aunt that he'd never seen two people more in love, or a groom who looked more conflicted. Kyle tried to imagine it his grandfather at 28, standing in this church, making promises he meant with all his heart, but knowing they were made under false pretenses. The courage it must have taken, or perhaps the desperation. From the church, they walked to what had been the medical clinic. The building was now a pharmacy, modernized and updated, but the structure was original. Mother worked here as a nurse's assistant, Greta said. She met Harold when he came in for treatment after a training injury. She told her sister she knew immediately he was different from the other soldiers. His eyes were kind, she said, and sad, as if he carried some great burden. They paused at a memorial stone in the village square. It listed the names of locals who had died in the war, soldiers, civilians, victims of bombing raids. Near the bottom, Kyle noticed two names, Friedrich Keller, 1898 to 1945. Greta Keller, 1929 to 1945. The safe housekeeper and his daughter, Klaus said quietly, following Kyle's gaze. From Operation Winterfall, they sheltered Harold and the defector. When the Gestapo raided the safe house, they died in the crossfire. Kyle felt sick. These were the civilian casualties mentioned in the OSS report. Real people with real names, killed because they'd helped his grandfather's mission. The village knows the truth now, Greta said. After reunification, German intelligence files were opened. Friedrich Keller was identified as having aided an Allied intelligence operation. His name was cleared of any suspicion of treason. He's considered a hero here now. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The people who died helping Harold's mission were remembered with honor, not shame. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the valley, with a view of the mountains stretching to the horizon. Spring was beginning to assert itself. Wildflowers dotted the grass between headstones, and birds sang in the surrounding trees. Greta led them to a simple grave marker. Anneliese Fischer, 1920 bis 1946. Beloved mother and daughter. Kyle stared at the stone, this final resting place of a woman he'd never known, but who had shaped his grandfather's entire life. She'd been 26 when she died, younger than Sophie was now. She'd survived the war only to die in its aftermath, alone and believing herself abandoned. He pulled the small box from his pocket, the one containing Harold's wedding ring. Greta had brought Anneliese's ring as well. The family gathered around the grave in a loose circle, 3 generations, 2 nations, finally united. Kyle spoke first, his voice unsteady. Anneliese Fischer, I'm Kyle Jacobs, Harold Jacobson's grandson. He asked me to bring you a message. He read from the letter Harold had written, the one they'd found in the cellar. You were my truth in a life of lies. I never stopped loving you. I'm sorry I couldn't come back. I'm sorry you waited. I hope, wherever you are, you know I never forgot. Not for a single day in 50 years. His voice broke on the last words. Sophie squeezed his hand as he placed Harold's ring on the gravestone beside a small vase of flowers. Greta stepped forward, adding Annaliese's ring beside it. "Mother," she said in German, then switched to English for Kyle and Sophie's benefit. "Mother, your Harold did come back, not in the way you hoped, but through his family, through our family. He never abandoned you by choice. He loved you until his last breath." The two rings rested together on the stone, finally reunited after 80 years of separation. In the morning light, their inscriptions caught the sun. "Forever together." Helene spoke next, her voice soft. "Grandmother, I never knew you, but I've heard the stories. How you were kind to everyone, how you worked tirelessly at the clinic, how you loved completely. Your daughter Greta inherited all of that. She raised us with the same values, love, forgiveness, hope," Werner added. "And now your family extends across an ocean, your great-grandchildren and your American family, all of us here together because of the love you and Harold shared." Thomas, the youngest to speak, said simply, "Great-grandmother, thank you for loving Harold Jacobson. Without that love, without their brief time together, none of us would be here." They stood in silence for a long moment. A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the flowers, carrying with it the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. Kyle thought about Harold standing in Montana mountains, carrying this loss alone for decades. He thought about Annalise, dying young, never knowing the truth about the man she'd married. So much loss. So much unnecessary pain caused by war and circumstance and the impossible choices people faced. But standing here now, surrounded by family, both branches of it, Kyle felt something shift. The loss was real. The pain had been real. But it hadn't been the end. Love had survived, transmitted through letters and memories and DNA. And now, finally, the two families Harold had kept separate could become one. "Thank you," Greta said quietly, looking at Kyle and Sophie. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping me tell her." "Thank you for finding him," Kyle replied. "For not giving up, for reaching out even when he couldn't bridge the gap himself." They remained at the grave for another hour, sharing stories, laughing at memories, weeping at losses. The following days in Bavaria passed in a blur of connection and discovery. Kyle and Sophie were welcomed into the fabric of Greta's family with a warmth that felt both surprising and inevitable. They shared meals, exchanged stories, and slowly began to understand the full scope of what Harold's silence had cost and what it had protected. On their third evening, Greta gathered everyone in her living room. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something I've kept until we could all be together." She produced a USB drive, holding it carefully as if it were fragile. "After Harold died, his lawyer in America sent me a package. Inside was this, with instructions that I should only watch it when his American family was present. I've been waiting." Kyle's heart began to race. "A video? Yes. He recorded it in the cabin, perhaps a month before he died. He wanted both families to see it together." They connected the drive to Greta's television, and after a moment Harold's face filled the screen. He was seated in the cabin's main room, the stone fireplace visible behind him. His face was gaunt with illness, but his eyes were alert, focused on the camera. "If you're watching this together," he began, his voice thin but steady, "then you've done what I couldn't." "Thank you." Kyle felt Sophie grip his hand tightly. Around the room, the entire family had fallen silent. "My name is Harold Jacobson," the recording continued. "Though most of you knew me as Harold Jacobs, I've lived 2 lives, loved 2 families, and carried the weight of that division for 75 years. It's time for the truth, all of it, spoken in my own words." For the next 20 minutes, Harold told his story. He spoke of his recruitment by the OSS, his training, his insertion into German military ranks. He described the 3 years of living as the enemy, the constant fear of discovery, the moral compromises required to maintain his cover. "I saved German soldiers' lives," he said, "men who were fighting against my country. I earned their medals, their trust, and then I betrayed them by passing intelligence to the Allies. Every day was a contradiction. Every friendship was built on deception." He paused, his face reflecting decades of carried pain. "Then I met Anneliese. She wasn't part of the mission, wasn't part of the plan. I should have stayed away. But I was 28 years old, thousands of miles from home, living a lie every moment of every day. And she saw me, or she saw the man I was pretending to be, and she loved that man. And God help me, I loved her back." Kyle watched his grandfather's face on the screen, seeing emotions he'd never witnessed in life. Raw grief, lingering guilt, but also finally permission to speak truth. When Operation Winterfall was activated, Anneliese was 3 months pregnant with Greta. I had to leave without explanation, knowing I could never return. My cover was compromised. If I went back, if anyone connected me to the intelligence leaks, Anneliese would be investigated, possibly arrested as a collaborator. The only way to keep her safe was to let Harold Jacobson die. He looked directly into the camera, as if seeing them all across time. "To my American family, Kyle, I'm sorry I kept this from you. I thought I was protecting you from complicated truths. I see now I was protecting myself from having to face what I'd done, what I'd sacrificed. To my German family, Greta, Klaus, Werner, Helene, all of you, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I'm sorry I chose duty over love, country over family. I told myself it was noble, that I was protecting you. But in truth, I was also a coward. The Iron Curtain was an excuse. Later, when it fell, I was afraid. Afraid of judgment, afraid of complicating lives that seemed settled." Harold's voice grew stronger, more urgent. "But I want you to know this. Anneliese was real, the only real thing in those years of deception. When I held her, I wasn't pretending. When I married her, meant every vow. And when I learned she had died," his voice broke. "When I learned she died thinking I'd abandoned her, it broke something in me that never healed. I married again. Kyle's grandmother was a good woman, and I cared for her deeply. But part of me never left that village in Bavaria. Part of me stayed with Anneliese, with the child I never met, with the life I sacrificed for the mission." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "The intelligence I provided helped shorten the war. The OSS told me it saved lives, perhaps thousands. But I've spent 70 years wondering, was it worth it? Not the mission itself, but the way I handled it afterward. The silence, the distance, the walls I built to keep these families separate. I don't have an answer. Maybe you do. Maybe by watching this together, by bridging the gap I couldn't cross, you'll find one." Harold's final words were directed at the camera with unmistakable purpose. "Visit Anneliese's grave for me. Tell her I never forgot. Tell her the war ended, the walls came down, but I could never find my way back to her. Tell her I'm sorry. And tell her that our love created something beautiful, a family that spans continents, that survived war and silence and loss. Tell her that love, real love, outlasts everything." The video ended. The screen went black. In Greta's living room, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Greta said quietly, "We've already told her, Father. Today, at her grave, we told her everything." Klaus wiped his eyes. He was both hero and coward, both selfless and selfish. He was human. And he was ours, Werner added. All of ours, even if he couldn't let himself believe it. Kyle stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. He thought about Harold Young, afraid, in love, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. He thought about the decades of silence, the weight carried alone. And he thought about this moment, this gathering of family that, Harold had made possible even while believing he couldn't do it himself. He did bridge the gap, Kyle said, turning back to the room. Maybe not in the way he wanted, maybe not while he was alive, but he left us the path, the letters, the documents, the video. He left us everything we needed to find each other. Sophie stood beside her father, and we followed it. We're here, both families, together. Thomas spoke up from where he sat with his cousins. So what happens now? We've met, we've shared the story. Do we just go back to our separate lives? No, Greta said firmly. Absolutely not. We're family. We stay family. The room filled with agreement, with plans. Klaus suggested regular video calls. Helene proposed alternating visits next year. The German family would come to Montana, see the cabin where Harold had lived his American life. Margit wanted to collaborate on a family history project. Thomas and Sophie were already exchanging contact information, discussing a photography project documenting both sides of the family. Kyle watched it unfold, this weaving together of lives that had been kept apart for so long. And he felt his grandfather's presence somehow, as if Harold were watching from somewhere beyond, finally at peace. The casualties of war didn't have to be permanent. Healing could begin, even after 80 years. Kyle and Sophie stayed in Bavaria for 2 weeks, far longer than they'd originally planned. Every day brought new discoveries, deeper connections. They hiked in the mountains where Harold had once trained with his regiment. They visited the lake where he and Anneliese had spent summer afternoons. They ate meals prepared from Anneliese's recipes, preserved by her sister and passed down through generations. On their final evening, Greta hosted a farewell dinner. The entire extended family gathered 15 people around tables pushed together, representing 3 generations and 2 continents. The conversation flowed in. Multiple languages, punctuated by laughter and the occasional need for translation. After dinner, as the younger cousins cleared dishes, Greta pulled Kyle aside. "I have something for you," she said, leading him to her study. She opened a drawer and removed a small wooden carving, perhaps 6 inches tall. It depicted an alpine scene, mountains, a small church, a lake. The detail was remarkable, clearly the work of skilled hands. "Harold sent this to me in 1998, Greta explained. "He carved it himself, said it was his memory of Garmisch, of where he'd been happiest. I want you to have it, to take back to the cabin. So both his homes are connected." Kyle turned the carving over. On the base, in Harold's handwriting, "To remember where my heart stayed." "I can't take this," Kyle protested. "It was his gift to you, and now it's my gift to you." His heart was divided between 2 places, 2 families. This carving represents one half. It should be reunited with the other. Kyle accepted it, overwhelmed by the gesture. "We'll treasure it. And Greta, you and your family, you're welcome in Montana anytime. The cabin is as much yours as it is ours. Next summer," she promised. "Klaus is already planning. He wants to see where his grandfather built his American life." The flight home gave Kyle time to process everything. Sophie slept beside him, her camera bag filled with hundreds of photographs documenting their journey. But the most important images, Kyle knew, weren't captured by any camera. They were the connections forged, the understanding reached, the family brought together. Montana in spring was muddy and raw, snow melting into rushing streams. The cabin looked different when they returned, smaller somehow, less isolated. Kyle knew it was his perspective that had changed, not the cabin itself. They spent the first day back cleaning, organizing, making the space livable again. Kyle installed proper lighting in the cellar, wanting to preserve Harold's legacy but also make it accessible. These weren't secrets to be hidden anymore. They were history, family history, that deserved to be acknowledged. He placed Greta's wooden carving on the mantel, next to the bronze star. 2 artifacts from Harold's divided life, finally side by side. Below them he hung a new photograph, the entire family at Anneliese's grave, German and American branches united. Word spread quickly in their small Montana town. Kyle had told the high school principal about his discovery, and within days, local news wanted the story. Local teacher discovers grandfather was World War II spy, the headline read. The article was respectful, focusing on Harold's service and sacrifice rather than sensationalizing the secrecy. It mentioned Operation Winterfall, the OSS commendation, and the reunion with the German family. Kyle was interviewed, and he spoke carefully, honoring both the heroism and the human cost. "My grandfather made impossible choices in impossible circumstances," Kyle told the reporter. "He served his country with distinction, but that service required sacrifices that affected him for the rest of his life. I'm proud of what he did and grateful that we can finally tell his story." The Historical Society contacted him about the documents. With Greta's permission, Kyle donated copies to their archive, the OSS papers, the mission records, the correspondence. Harold Jacobson's service would be preserved, studied, remembered. The originals stayed in the cabin where Harold had left them. But the most meaningful legacy wasn't public recognition or historical preservation. It was private, personal. It was video calls with Greta every Sunday evening. It was emails from Klaus about his planned visit. It was Sophie collaborating with Thomas on a photography exhibition about divided families reunited. One evening, about a month after their return, Kyle sat on the cabin's porch with a beer and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. His phone buzzed with a text from Werner, sharing a photograph of his grandson's first birthday party. "Wish you could be here," the message read. "Maybe next time." Kyle smiled and replied, "Definitely next time. Family should be together." Family. The word had expanded, grown to encompass people he hadn't known existed 2 months ago. People who shared his blood, his history, his grandfather's complicated legacy. He thought about Harold, about the young man who'd fallen in love in wartime, the agent who'd completed his mission at devastating personal cost, the old man who'd lived alone in these mountains, carrying unbearable secrets. And he thought about the final gift Harold had given them, the courage to reach across decades of separation and make something whole from what had been broken. Sophie joined him on the porch, carrying her own drink. Greta emailed. "She's working on the family tree, wants to make sure she has all our connections right. Apparently we have second cousins in Austria. She just discovered." "The family keeps growing," Kyle observed. "That's how families work, Dad. They expand, they connect, they heal." She was right, of course. Harold had tried to keep his two worlds separate, believing separation was protection, but separation had only created more pain, more loss. Connection, messy, complicated, challenging connection, that was where healing lived. "I've been thinking," Sophie said, "about turning the cellar into a kind of memorial. Not morbid, just preserving it, making it tell the story properly. Maybe some interpretive plaques, timeline displays. So when the German family visits, they can understand the American side of Harold's life." "I like that," Kyle said. "He preserved their story in that cellar. We should honor that." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the mountains. Somewhere in these peaks, Harold had walked alone for decades, carrying his secrets and his grief. But he wasn't alone anymore. His story had been told, his families united, his sacrifices acknowledged and honored. The casualties of war didn't have to be permanent. Love could survive separation, truth could emerge from secrecy, and families torn apart could find their way back together. It might take 80 years, might require courage from new generations willing to bridge old divides, but it was possible. Harold Jacobson had proven that, not through his wartime heroics or his intelligence work, but through something simpler and more profound. He'd loved completely, suffered deeply, and left behind a path for others to finish what he couldn't. Kyle raised his beer toward the darkening sky, toward the mountains that had witnessed so much. "Thank you, grandfather," he said quietly, "for trusting us to do this right." Beside him, Sophie raised her glass as well. "To Harold and Annalise. May they finally have peace." The mountains offered no answer, but Kyle didn't need one. The peace Harold had sought wasn't in silence or isolation. It was here, in connection, in family brought together, in love that outlasted everything, even war, even death, even 80 years of separation. And now, finally, Harold Jacobson could rest. Summer arrived in Montana with a rush of green growth and warm days. Kyle prepared the cabin for visitors, cleaning rooms that hadn't been used in decades, stocking the kitchen, making sure the generator was reliable. Greta, Klaus, Werner, and Helene were coming for 2 weeks, their first visit to America, their first chance to see where Harold had lived his second life. The day they arrived, Kyle felt the same nervous anticipation he'd experienced in Munich. But when Greta stepped out of the rental van and looked up at the cabin against its backdrop of granite cliffs, her expression was one of wonder. "It looks just like his carving," she breathed. "He captured it exactly." They spent the first days exploring the cabin, the surrounding forest, the small town where Harold had bought supplies and maintained his quiet existence. Kyle showed them the high school where he taught, introduced them to neighbors who remembered the old man who'd lived alone in the mountains. "He was kind," one elderly woman recalled, "helped me when my car broke down once, wouldn't accept payment. But he never talked much about himself. Always seemed like he was carrying something heavy." Klaus and Werner hiked the mountain trails with Kyle, following paths Harold must have walked countless times. They talked about their grandfather's contradictions, the hero and the haunted man, the spy who'd saved lives, and the husband who'd disappeared. "Do you think he found any peace here?" Werner asked as they stood at a summit, looking out over the valley. "I think he tried," Kyle replied. "This place gave him solitude, safety, but peace, I don't know. Maybe peace wasn't possible for him. Maybe living with what he'd done, what he'd lost, was the price he paid for his choices. Or maybe," Klaus suggested, "peace was never the point. Maybe he chose to carry the burden so that others, our mothers, our families, wouldn't have to." It was a generous interpretation, and Kyle wanted to believe it. Perhaps Harold's silence hadn't been weakness or cowardice. Perhaps it had been a different kind of courage, the willingness to carry pain alone rather than distribute it to others. One evening, they held a ceremony in the cellar. Kyle had completed Sophie's idea, installing subtle lighting and small plaques that told Harold's story. The OSS documents were displayed behind glass, alongside photographs from both sides of his life. The wedding rings, Harold's and Annalise's, sat in a place of honor, reunited at last. Greta stood before the display, reading the carefully written text that explained Operation Winterfall, the mission's cost, Harold's decades of silence. Tears tracked down her weathered face. "He kept everything," she said. "Every memory, every artifact. He couldn't speak about it, but he couldn't let it go either." "Because it was real," Helene said quietly. "The only real part of those years. He had to preserve it, even if he had to hide it." Klaus placed his hand on the glass case holding the rings. "Mother, father, your love survived everything. War, distance, death, 80 years of separation. Look at us now, all of us here together. That's your legacy. Not the secrets or the silence, but this, family united." They stood together in the cellar, the space that had held Harold's secrets for so long, and Kyle felt the weight of history settling into something bearable, even beautiful. Pain acknowledged, loss honored, but transformed into connection. Before the German family left, they all drove to the small cemetery where Kyle's grandmother was buried. Beside her grave, they placed a memorial stone for Harold, with his true name, Harold Jacobson, 1921 to 2024. "Beloved father, grandfather, and great-grandfather to two families. May he finally rest in peace. And beneath that, at Greta's suggestion, reunited in love with Anneliese Fischer, 1920 to 1946. Now they're together, Greta said, at least in memory, at least in the hearts of those who loved them. The farewell at the airport was tearful but not final. Plans were already made: Christmas in Bavaria, next summer's reunion, video calls every Sunday. The separation was over. The two branches of Harold's family had grown together, intertwined, inseparable now. Driving back to the cabin alone, Kyle felt different than he had 3 months ago. Then, he'd been a man seeking to understand a distant grandfather. Now he carried a deeper understanding of sacrifice, of love's complexity, of the ways war's casualties extended far beyond the battlefield. He pulled up to the cabin as sunset painted the sky. Inside, the space felt different, no longer a repository of secrets, but a bridge between past and present, between two families, between love and loss. Kyle walked to the mantel, looking at the artifacts displayed there. The bronze star, Greta's wooden carving, the photograph of both families at Anneliese's grave, and beside them a new addition, a framed letter from Thomas, thanking Kyle for giving us back the grandfather we never knew, and the American family we'd always hoped for. He picked up a photo album Sophie had created, titled Harold's Bridge, One Man, Two Families, 80 Years of Love. It contained images from both families' histories, woven together chronologically: Harold and Anneliese's wedding, Kyle's father as a child, Greta's family growing up in Bavaria, Kyle with baby Sophie, and finally the recent photos of everyone together, proof that love could outlast anything. Outside, twilight deepened into night. Kyle stood at the window, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed Harold's silent vigil, and he spoke aloud, to the grandfather he'd finally come to know. "We did it. We brought them together. The families you kept separate, we made them whole. Anneliese knows the truth now," we told her. "Your daughter knows you loved her mother. Your grandchildren know your story. And we're all here, all connected, all family." He paused, then added, "You can rest now. The war's over. The walls are down. And the casualties, they're healing. Finally healing. The mountains offered their eternal silence, but Kyle no longer found it empty. It was full of memory, of sacrifice, of love that had survived impossible odds. Harold Jacobson had lived between two worlds, unable to unite them. But his legacy, the people he'd loved, the families he'd created, had finished what he couldn't. Some secrets needed to be buried, but others needed to be unearthed so healing could begin. Harold's secret had been both prison and protection. Now, exposed to light, it had become something else entirely: a bridge, a connection, a testament to love's endurance. And finally, after 80 years of separation, after decades of silence and sacrifice, Harold Jacobson had brought his two families home to each other. Peace, Kyle thought, wasn't absence of pain. It was pain transformed into purpose, loss transformed into love, separation transformed into reunion. Harold had found his peace at last, and so, in doing so, had they all.